Today is November 22nd, 2015. 52 years ago today, November 22nd, 1963, President John Kennedy was killed in Dallas, Texas. And here's a speech on the PBS website that he was scheduled to give that day, either in the afternoon or evening. He never got the chance to because of the fact that his brains were splattered all over the limousine seat, and somehow he couldn't rise above that and give the speech anyhow. What a slacker. Now, this took place in Dallas, Texas, and that's where George Herbert Walker Bush lived, in Texas. George Herbert Walker Bush was the head of the CIA on November 22nd, 1963, and it seems pretty clear that the CIA wanted Kennedy to be removed, to be eliminated. George Bush Sr. was the head of the CIA. Whether it was his personal idea to kill Kennedy or somebody else's idea that he just approved of, I don't know. But it seems pretty certain that George Herbert Walker Bush had a very responsible role as the head of the CIA there in Texas. And later, George Herbert Walker Bush became the governor of Texas. Still after that, he became the vice president on the coattails of Ronald Reagan. And after 8 years of Reagan, Bush rode into the presidency. And 8 years later, rode his son, George W. Bush Jr., into the office of the presidency. What I didn't read yet was this speech by Kennedy addressing the Dallas Citizens Council and the members of the Dallas Assembly. The theme of the speech was the connection between leadership and learning. This speech he never got the chance to give because his brains were splattered all over the back of his presidential car. He says the link between leadership and learning is not only essential at the community level, but it's even more indispensable in world affairs. Ignorance and misinformation can handicap foreign policy and handicap the country's security. Ignorance and misinformation. Well, misinformation and ignorance are certainly weapons that were used to cover up the murder of John Kennedy, who never got to read this speech, keeping us ignorant about what really happened and giving us a bunch of misinformation to lead us to believe that Lee Harvey Oswald, with a ridiculous shotgun that only held one bullet, could only fire one bullet at a time, which is practically the same technology that they had in 1775, or single fire muskets. It was practically a single fire musket, the rifle that Oswald was alleged to have murdered the president with at least 3 shots having been heard and found, the bullets and the destruction by at least 3 bullets, probably much more than 3 bullets, but at the very least, when he didn't have the time to reload that single fire musket that quickly within that space of time, when all the evidence indicates that the bullets came from in front through the front windshield of the president's car, that the bullet entered his forehead and went out the back of his head and blew out the back of his skull, making a small entrance hole wound in the forehead of Kennedy and blowing out the skull in the back as it exited. which is exactly what would happen with a bullet. But Lee Harvey Oswald was behind, allegedly behind the president, firing from way up above and behind, making the opposite of what the actual trajectory of the bullet would appear to be from the injuries on the president's head. Misinformation and ignorance is what we were given about the Kennedy assassination. And the people most likely responsible for that, the CIA, whose head was George Herbert Walker Bush, loved ignorance and misinformation to cover their tracks. And used ignorance and misinformation for the next 40 years at least. For at least the next 40 years, through himself, through his vice presidency of Ronald Reagan, a knucklehead whose brains had turned to jello, who was not physically or mentally equipped to be, or fit to be, holding the office of the President of the United States. Ronald Reagan was not mentally competent to be the most powerful person in the world. He wasn't mentally competent to be mopping a floor, to be operating a mop bucket. Ronald Reagan, when he was president, was not competent for that sort of a task. Certainly not to be putting his finger on the nuclear buttons. But he was just a wooden-headed puppet being run by George Herbert Walker Bush, the former head of the CIA, during the time of the assassination of John Kennedy. And then after 2 terms, Bush got shooed into office. And then 8 years later, he shooed his son, George Walker Bush Jr., into the presidency, even though George Walker Bush lost the election in 2000, received fewer votes from the American public than his opponent, Al Gore. But he happened to be the governor of Texas, and his younger brother happened to be the governor of Florida. And in Florida, they just happened to have some very peculiar irregularities in the voting process that just happened to tip the scales for George W. Bush Jr. What a surprise when his younger brother Jeb Bush was the governor of Florida. Ignorance and misinformation. So that's it for November 22nd, 2015.